Robert Wright, visiting professor of science and religion here at Union Theological Seminary. I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and also I want to thank the John Templeton Foundation for supporting the series of conversations that tonight's dialogue is part of. The name of this series of conversations is Contentions, and one reason for that is that we contend with big issues. And I have to say I'm not aware of any political scientist who is more accustomed to contending with big issues than our guest tonight, Francis Fukuyama. He teaches political science at Stanford, is known for writing very big books. I mean big in a figurative sense, but also sometimes they are literally big. So to give you an example from his recent output, so 4 years ago in 2011, he published a book over 500 pages called The Origins of Political Order, From Pre-Human Times to the French Revolution. And then 3 years later, last year, he followed that with a sequel of over 600 pages called Political Order and Political Decay, From the Industrial Revolution to the Globalization of Democracy. So all told, that goes from pre-human times to globalization. So I guess you can be excused for taking 1,100 pages to cover that ground. Frank's written a lot of books, many of them comparable in ambition to those, a number of them bestsellers. I guess the book of his that is at least most obviously relevant to what we're going to talk about tonight is probably his first book, a very famous book, The End of History and the Last Man, which was based on an essay he had written called The End of History. I think the essay came out in 1989. Frank posited in the End of History argument that there was a kind of direction to history and that it was in some sense a positive direction. And one thing we're going to ask tonight is whether it's possible to maintain a very positive view of the future in light of some trends and developments these days that many people find troubling, both domestically and abroad. Some people find them so troubling that they're talking in more or less apocalyptic terms. And actually, I think that somewhat apocalyptic scenarios are plausible. And tonight, I hope to get a chance to run some of those by Frank and hope that he can talk me out of them and cheer me up. Turns out I'm not the only person who's interested in connecting Frank's end of history argument to kind of recent troubling developments. I don't know if you saw in the Atlantic yesterday, did you see the piece by Peter Beinart mentioning you?
No.
Okay, well then I will do you the favor of quoting from it. So Peter Beinart was writing, it was a piece about the big speech on terrorism that President Obama gave on Sunday night. And the piece includes this paragraph. Obama is a kind of Fukuyamian. Like Francis Fukuyama, the author of the famed 1989 essay, The End of History, he believes that powerful structural forces will lead liberal democracies to triumph over their foes, so long as these democracies don't do stupid things like persecuting Muslims at home or invading Muslim lands abroad. His Republican opponents, by contrast, believe that powerful and sinister enemies are overwhelming America, either overseas or domestically. Now, I don't want you to respond to that right now. I want to leave dangling in the air the question of whether you consider Obama a Fukuyamian, and for that matter, whether you are an Obaman. But before we get to that, I just want to try to get a little clear on the end of history thesis. So here's the way I remember it. In 1989, I was in Washington as you were. It was an amazing time. The Berlin Wall had fallen. It seemed like, we had won the Cold War. People were saying, whoa, this is amazing. This decades-long struggle with the Soviet Union, and we won. And as I understood your essay, you kind of said, well, actually, you can view this as victory in a much longer struggle, centuries, not decades, and it's a struggle among ideas about how people should be governed, and the winner is liberal democracy. And the essay became a book, and the rest, as they say, is the end of history. So I want to give you a chance before we go further to correct me if I've said anything that's not true, expand, if you want, on your thesis, and also make sure and tell us what exactly you mean by liberal democracy in the process.
Sure. By the way, I should tell you that Bob Wright is the reason that my first volume that he mentioned begins with pre-human times, because until I read his book, The Moral Animal, about evolutionary psychology, which draws heavily on not just the behavior of so-called primitive peoples, but also continuities between primate behavior and human behavior. I had no idea about that stuff, and so you're important, very important in that aspect of my own intellectual development. So the end of history is really a story about modernization, or as we put it these days, development, right? I used to run the International Development Program at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and my students would go to poor countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and try to help these countries develop. And basically what that means is a multi-dimensional transformation of societies, which is what Europe and North America went through initially, what China, Singapore, South Korea have gone through in the 20th century, and what a lot of very poor countries hope to do today, which is to have much higher living standards, make use of science and technology to prevent their kids from dying before they're 5 years old, and then in the political sphere to have a society in which a kind of open and equal opportunity is available to all citizens. And the economic and the political parts go together, because I think that it's very hard to have a very high level of economic prosperity if people are not given the freedom to take opportunities and make opportunities for themselves. So this is a question that has been debated endlessly by social theorists, the most famous of all of them that believed in this idea of history. So what he would have called history, what today we call development or modernization, was Karl Marx. Marx said, yes, there is such a thing as history. It begins with primitive, agrarian societies. Then you go through feudalism and capitalism. And then he said the end of history is communism, where you abolish private property and so on and so forth. And all I did in 1989 was to observe, it looks like we're not going to get there. That I agree with the Marxists that there is this thing called history, development, modernization, but where it seemed to be terminating was not in communism, which seemed to me a manifest failure as an economic and a political system, but in some combination of liberal democracy and a market economy. And I still basically, believe that. I think that the question then becomes, is there an alternative? So there are many countries that are not there yet. Maybe some countries will never get there, but I don't think that you can have, the full panoply of things we associate with modernization or modern life unless you have a certain form of political regime, meaning one that, and so the definition of liberal democracy would be one in which there's an equal balance between three things. You have to have a state that can actually provide order and services and public goods and the like. The state has to be constrained by a rule of law that makes sure that rulers don't just arbitrarily make up the rules in their own self-interest as they go along. And then the state has to obey the wishes of as large a portion of the population as possible rather than serving their own narrow self-interest. And that, I think, is the modern formula. And I don't really see an alternative out there that's going to get us to, what we associate with modernity other than a liberal democracy. We can talk about this. The only real challenger at the moment, I think, is China, because it's an authoritarian state that has done extremely well in terms of economic development. But, how stable that is, whether that regime can continue over the next generation or two in its current form, I have my doubts about. So that's basically the theory. I think where people misinterpreted me was they thought that I was one of these old type Marxists that thought that there was this inevitable historical process that would lead everybody there, everywhere and always. And I never believed that. I have a much, mushier version of that, which is that people will get there because of the competition between systems, and in the long run, this system is going to turn out to be more durable. But that's a debatable point, especially these days.
Yeah, it is, and I guess one way, and you got a certain amount of blowback during the, I guess, 90s when bad things happened around the world, Bosnia and so on, and people said, see, you're wrong, this isn't utopia, history hasn't ended. And first of all, I sympathize with you because, I wrote a book positing a kind of direction to history, Nonzero, and in fact, you generously reviewed it for the Wilson Quarterly, I think. And people took it as being pretty optimistic, and like after 9/11 and stuff, they said, see, you were wrong. And when people say your book is wrong, you have two choices. You can either say, you're right, I was wrong, or you can say you misinterpreted it. I prefer the latter, and always have. Now, Frank, in principle, may be different because he's actually known for revisiting ideas he's held. Frank was at one point identified with neoconservatives, quite rightly, I think, but then kind of famously broke with them in light of the accumulation of evidence after the Iraq War. So maybe you're willing to say something other than that your critics got it wrong. Is there anything about your argument that you would rethink in light of things going on now?
Yes, well, see, that's why you have to buy my last 2 volumes, because that contains the revision of the original thesis.
I shouldn't have told them how long they are, probably. But they're well worth the reading.
So yes, I would say several things. The first is that after spending all this time, reading history and thinking about this issue, I have realized that getting to liberal democracy, or actually I have this phrase, getting to Denmark, where Denmark is actually not necessarily the country Denmark, which is a very nice place, but it's more this symbolic endpoint of history, which is democratic, prosperous, stable, and has vanishingly low levels of corruption. And the argument, that I make in the last 2 volumes is that Denmark got to be Denmark through a whole bunch of historical accidents that probably cannot be replicated in Somalia, Haiti, Nigeria, any number of other countries. And in general, the historical process is not this machine, and again, that, I think from Marxism, you get this view of, historical development, that there are these powerful forces that, compel every country to develop along a certain path, whereas I think that the reality is that a lot of the countries that fortunately end up like Denmark, we're lucky, and not every country will be like that. The second thing that I think as Americans is particularly important is the whole theme of political decay, which is the last part of the 2nd volume, because what I argue is that a modern state is not a natural construct. Our natural sociability inclines us to favor family and friends, basically. And the modern state requires that we don't do that. It's supposed to be impersonal. So you're supposed to pick the most qualified, person for a job, and not your cousin or, your old roommate from college or whatever. And therefore, I think the Denmark-like final state is always under attack. It's always trying to be reappropriated by people. And I think that's kind of what's happened in the United States, in American democracy, that with the rise of very powerful, well-funded interest groups, you have a lot of money and power operating in American politics in a way that's kind of reappropriated, a state that's supposed to be able to serve impersonally the whole American population, and instead, serves much narrower interests. This is not just a fault of democracy. I mean, I think any political system is liable to this, but it means that this story about, a progressive history gets punctuated by big regressions, and I don't think there's any necessary reason to think that the regressions are always going to be overcome and the system is going to get fixed.
Okay. Another possible regression, I'd say, is symbolized by Donald Trump. He, and I mean it. I mean, I suppose everyone's heard of his latest proposal from yesterday to immediately bar entry to the United States, to immediately bar all Muslims from from entering the United States. And he said a number of things, you know, keep a database on all Muslims and so on. And this may have, I don't know, particular resonance for you. I've never discussed this with you, I've read that your grandfather was actually put in an internment camp for Japanese Americans during World War II, which just goes to show you that, you know, bad things can happen when people are scared. And the prospect this raises, you know, is that a liberal democracy, by which I think you mean, among other things, a democracy that respects civil liberties and civil rights, can choose through democratic means to become what's been called an illiberal democracy. And I think with a sufficient amount of fear instilled in the populace, I mean, I've personally been kind of shocked by what Republicans have been saying during the presidential campaign and the positive feedback they've gotten, not only Trump. And when you look at the relatively modest grounds for fear at this point, right, in terms of actual numbers killed in terrorist incidents, I think it's kind of scary to think what could happen if things got much worse. So I'm wondering how real you think the possibility is of sliding into a democracy that is something other than liberal.
I think that it depends on the country, so I think the danger of that is actually higher in Europe, and particularly in countries like the Netherlands and France that actually have very large Muslim minority populations, because they've not done a good job in assimilating them, and in the long run I just see nothing but political and social conflict over that. In the United States, you know, I guess I'm more optimistic because, you know, the Republicans, you know, at most are like 35% of the whole electorate, and Donald Trump gets, you know, 30% of that 30%. And so the actual number of, and then even that 30% of the 30% haven't really thought about it all that carefully, you know, as presumably they will when you get closer to the election. So I actually think that the American people have better sense, you know, that they like to blow off steam, you know, by telling a pollster that they'd vote for some outrageous candidate. But, you know, when you get through this interminable campaign season, they end up making more sensible choices. But you're right. I mean, I absolutely think that we overestimate how dangerous terrorism is in the scheme of things. I think in the long run, China is a much bigger rival and challenge for the United States than, you know, these radical Islamists, and that the big danger is always in our overreaction to them. One of them was invading Iraq, you know, after September 11th, and, you know, you can just imagine if they actually get their hands on a nuclear weapon or a biological weapon and serious numbers of people get killed, then I think all bets are off. I mean, then I think you could really imagine the United States becoming a, you know, something other than a liberal society.
Right, and I mean, you're kind of getting toward my apocalyptic scenario, which is just that you're right, we have overreacted in the past to the threat of terrorism. It seems to me we have a habit of overreacting. That the definition of overreaction in this context is that it makes the problem worse. It increases the number of Muslims who sympathize with ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever, and makes homegrown terrorism more likely, and so on. And then if you overreact to that, and I've got to say, all signs are, to me, after San Bernardino, that overreaction remains a real possibility, then you can imagine it just, you know, the so-called clash of civilizations becoming kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, or at any rate, the whole turmoil lasting long enough for someone to get their hands on nuclear weapons, a weapon of mass destruction, or so on. I guess what worries me is that it's a positive feedback system, not positive in the sense of good, but in the sense that the two forces reinforce it. They're bad forces that reinforce each other, kind of, you know, fear on our side, hatred on theirs, and so on. You're less worried, it sounds like.
Well, you know, I think that you can imagine events that really would trigger a really bad overreaction. But like I said, you know, after September 11th, we made a lot of mistakes, but I think we eventually corrected for them. And I think that, you know, in time, we could probably correct for, you know. the ones that, you know, we've made up till now.
But, you know, even with ISIS, like I guess it was 14 or 15 months ago that Obama didn't say I'm declaring war on them, but gave this big speech about how we were going to use military forces. It was a serious threat. It was almost a de facto declaration of war, at least in the sense that his political fortunes were now tied to ISIS being at least gradually vanquished. And a lot of the explicit rationale for this was, okay, so, you know, if we don't get rid of ISIS, people can go to ISIS, would-be terrorists, receive training, come back here, and do bad things in America. And I actually wrote a piece at the time. I didn't really take a position on what we should do about ISIS. I mean, it's a non-trivial threat, and then separate from that, there's the humanitarian argument. So it's a complicated issue, but what I said was, wait a second, actually, so far, actual terrorist events in the United States done in the name of jihad have not been people that have succeeded, have not been people who went and trained in some piece of territory controlled by Al-Qaeda or ISIS. It's been people like the Tsarnaev brothers or Major Hassan, people who were already over here, who were inspired by jihadist doctrine. And of course, the jihadist propaganda depends very heavily on this theme that the U.S. is at war with Islam. So I just said, maybe before we basically declare war on something called the Islamic State, rightly or wrongly, we should at least consider this effect, the possibility of this exacerbating homegrown terrorism. I would now say San Bernardino is, at a minimum, not flagrantly at odds with the argument I was making. We don't know that much about it. And so far as I know, no one brought that up. It was not part of the conversation. And that was all I was saying. Can we at least talk about this? So it just seems to me we were going back to this reflex that was manifest in the Iraq War, which is, if there's terrorism, there must be a nation state that it's ultimately emanating from, and we have to go deal with that. And so I'm just saying, I mean, maybe that's a little thing, but it seems to me we're really not dealing very rationally and level-headedly with this thing, even now, long after Iraq. Sorry, that's a long question. It's actually not even a question.
I didn't hear the question in there.
Okay, so put a question mark at the end. Do you agree? We can move on. I take his silence as assent.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, I actually just don't think it's an important, I mean, in the long run, I actually don't think that, as I said, I think in terms of the larger historical question, this long-run competition with China is going to be much more consequential than anything that goes on in the Middle East. I mean, why is it that ISIS attacks people in cafes or in, you know, centers for disabled people? I mean, it's because they're basically, yeah, I mean, well, not just that, but it's not a powerful organization. I mean, they're just disgruntled individuals. In the modern world, they can kill, you know, a few dozen people, you know, in small groups, but in the end, that's not a big deal. China, in 10, 15 years, is going to have a bigger economy than the United States, and it's going to have a very, very different political system. It's going to be able to reshape the entire global order, and they're much smarter than these ISIS people. You know, they're patient, they have objectives that are not our objectives, but you know, they're not so flagrant in shoving this stuff in your face that they provoke this immediate reaction. And it is not a democratic political system. I mean, it's a very deep challenge, I think, to our way of life, you know, because ISIS, I mean, in the Middle East, people do not want to live under this kind of, you know, terrorist regime. They hate it. I mean, the vast majority of people in Muslim countries do not want to live under this form of government. Whereas China, you know, in a certain sense has become a model for not just, you know, 1.3 billion Chinese, but a lot of other people in the world who say, yeah, I'd like to have, you know, semiconductors and, you know, global exports and an authoritarian political system. Mm-hmm. So that's the sense in which I think you're focusing on the wrong thing if you think that ISIS is going to be, you know, the death of Western civilization, because you know, I really think that we can handle that one.
Of course, the good news is China, A, doesn't want to establish a global caliphate. B, I think doesn't define its relations to us in nearly such zero-sum terms more broadly as ISIS does. I mean, it's certainly not a democracy. That's not the same as saying it can't coexist with us in principle. I mean, I guess oddly, one of the things that concerns me most about China is that even authoritarian regimes are ultimately responsive to some extent to popular sentiment. There's a lot of anti-Americanism, Chinese nationalism there. So I guess I kind of agree that it's in that sense concerning, because that's the kind of thing that can lead leaders to behave what, from the point of view of the state, is irrational.
But see, I think that in terms of the long-term historical competition that I was talking about in that original End of History article, it's not, in short-term foreign policy matters, do they challenge you over a bunch of rocks in the Pacific Ocean? The question is one of ideas, because they've got a very different idea, that they can base a modern civilization, very high levels of material prosperity, on a political system that grants its citizens no freedom. That's really the challenge. It's an ideational challenge.
So you can see it becoming such an attractive model, not just thriving itself, becoming such an attractive model that various nations emulate it, and perhaps even ultimately the United States.
It's already the case,
Right.
In Africa, Latin America, there are a lot of authoritarian regimes that get a lot of assistance from China, and they say, yeah, this is our model. We're going to be part of the global economy, but we're not going to have a democracy.
Okay. Now, a question I promised to get back to is Obama a Fukuyamian? I mean, do you see, it sounds like maybe he is in a certain sense. I mean, it sounds like you're professing a kind of faith that if you don't screw up egregiously on the terrorism front, that is not going to impede the ordinary course of events.
Well, I think that if the question is a struggle between ideas, you have to promote your idea, and I really don't think we've done that terribly well in the last few years. The society has to act with a certain amount of self-confidence and be willing to make investments, that stand behind that. So in that sense, I think President Obama himself could have been a little bit more, forthcoming in in a lot of dimensions without going to all of the extremes of his predecessor. But I think so. This is another important point where I would differ with a traditional Marxist. They really did have this idea that there's this historical mechanism, all of these deep historical forces, and in a certain sense, human agency wasn't important. That these it was classes that shaped history. And I think classes do shape history, but individual leadership, individual choices that politicians make are incredibly important. And absent, somebody with a vision to articulate, what the right kind of society is, without the ability to mobilize people behind that, you're not going to have a democracy. So you don't have democracy without Democrats, meaning without people that believe in democracy and want to struggle for it and so forth. And so I would never take individual agency out of the calculations as to which of these systems is going to prevail in the end.
Okay. I want to talk a little about technology, which is something I know you pay close attention to. In fact, where you and I met was, I think, in this series of kind of seminars you held occasionally when you were at,
That's right.
at the School of Advanced International Studies in D.C. when I lived there. And whether it was the official theme or just a recurring theme, but there was a lot of technology discussed there. That's where I first heard about Google, before anybody had heard about it. And it was, and I think back then, Paul Wolfowitz was dean of. I didn't realize that I was in the midst of a neocon beehive. I really didn't. I mean, it's funny. The neoconservatism until around 2000 or so, I would say, to me was mainly about domestic policy. You heard a lot about neoconservative domestic policy, much less about foreign policy.
Right.
But now I know that I was right in the thick of the cabal there. But anyway, that's okay, because I actually learned a lot about technology, and I know you've thought a lot about it. And I want to talk about some scenarios you hear. For example, let's take the ultimate in upbeat, technologically determinist scenarios, the so-called singularity. I'm sure you've heard about this. As I kind of dimly understand it, the idea is that, first of all, it involves technological change happening faster and faster, and I think it gets to a point where you just can't predict what's on the other side of it, but for some reason there's faith that it's going to be good. Ray Kurzweil is associated with a view that I've probably mischaracterized, but anyway, to the extent that I can, there's some sort of faith that technology is really leading to some kind of utopia. Have you thought?
Yeah, I think it's a stupid idea. I mean, actually. So there's actually a Singularity University at the NASA Ames Research Center in Mountain View near where I live in midst of Silicon Valley, which was inspired by Kurzweil. But I think his specific idea about the singularity is that it's about artificial intelligence. And the view is that when circuit density in an electronic computer reaches the scale of the circuit density in the human brain, that it will take on the characteristics of a human brain, including emotions, consciousness, and the like. And he's made various predictions, or people have made various predictions, just given Moore's law, when we're going to get there. We're still a couple of decades, away from this. And I just think this is an idiotic idea, because, and actually it was your book, Nonzero, that made the case the best, which is that, it kind of assumes that all human beings are wet computers. They're just a bunch of electrical switches that, take in sensory information and process it, and so forth, and that something like consciousness or emotion or the feeling of human subjectivity is just a kind of natural outgrowth of circuit density. And my view is that this is a view of what it means to be a human being that only like a 21-year-old, guy with Asperger's just sits around, in front of his computer screen all day and wishes he could upload himself into his own computer. Only someone like that could think this, right? That it kind of is missing this whole other.
Kurzweil doesn't fit that description, though. By the way, he's older for one thing.
He may not, but I think that. It really it kind of bespeaks a kind of truncated understanding of what humans are, that it's just the reasoning part that matters. And it's just this huge leap of faith, as you said yourself in Nonzero, to think that something like consciousness will simply arise as a result of neural connections.
Yeah, there's another issue I have with this view. I know Kurzweil does believe, and I think this is true, that technological change happens faster and faster and faster and faster. In fact, I think that's a pattern you can actually document. There's probably contention over this, but I think it goes back millennia. I think it's always been the case that technological evolution, on balance, tends to accelerate. And it seems to me that people have a certain amount of trouble adapting to technological change. In fact, that's one thing that's happening now with social media and so on. It changes the distribution of power. It changes what kinds of groups organize. Some of them perhaps more passionate about certain political causes than is ideal, and suddenly it's a new group and nobody knows how to deal with them. So I just don't get the assumption that change accelerating is like going to be anything other than a destabilizing force in the short run, even though I think things can work out in the long run.
Yeah, I would not immediately accept the proposition that change is happening so much faster than it did in previous ages. If you look at the technological changes between the years 1850 and 1900 compared to 1950 and 2000, I actually think that the change was greater in that earlier period, because the United States went from being a primarily agrarian society where everybody was living on a family farm to being an urban industrial society in that 50-year period. And I actually don't think anything on a comparable scale brought about by technology has occurred in the 50-year period from the middle of the 20th century to its end. I mean, we can argue about, but I don't think it should be the issue is not that it's tied to the rate of technological change. I mean, ever since the Industrial Revolution, the rate has been very fast, and it's very disruptive. And then the question is, does it pose challenges that will be solved by more technology or not? And there, I think there's some reasons to be worried, because if you think about, so one of the bigger long-term historical issues is that human beings lived in a Malthusian world up until the last 200 years, meaning that productivity gains did not keep up with population growth for the most part, so that the vast majority of people alive in the world were in danger of starving to death if there's a bad harvest or a drought or some external shock. And it's only since this big growth in productivity that begins in the late 1800s in England that we get out of this Malthusian trap, and we tend to believe that every year is going to bring growth and more prosperity than the year before. And if you look at this in the 50,000 years that human species has been around, the last 200 years where we've avoided this Malthusian state is a pretty small period of time. And it is also, I think, a leap of faith to assume that henceforth, for the rest of time, technology will always produce these kinds of productivity gains and will solve the problems that it itself creates, such that it'll be onwards and upwards.
I think it's certainly a mistake to assume it'll solve the problems it creates, soon enough for the problems not to be disruptive. And I don't mean disruptive in the Silicon Valley sense of good disruption. On this issue of, it's hard to quantify the rate of technological change, but I would say that in, say, the last 50 years, which is, so what, from 75, 65 to this year, things, for example, it is really ceased to be the case that physical proximity is a prerequisite for socializing. As a result of that, you've gotten a bunch of groups that previously wouldn't have been organized and in touch that are in touch. One of these is a kind of a global, quote, jihad. And in a certain sense, the kind of Donald Trump fans, the ones who are in effect playing a non-zero sum game with global jihad, in the sense that, the more scared they get, these two groups strengthen each other, basically, as you can see. And these Donald Trump fans, and for that matter, groups on the left, any ideological group now, is, as has been said by a lot of people, is much better able to insulate itself from alternative information and so on, builds its own little cocoon. So, these seem to me like big changes. The other thing I'd say is, well, I'll just leave it there. This seems to me like a fundamental change in social organization, and it's far from the only thing that's happened lately.
Yeah, I would say, though, that those are not the biggest challenges and not going to be the biggest disruptions. I think income inequality that everybody is now talking about is completely driven by technological advance, that smart machines can substitute for all sorts of forms of human labor in ways that they couldn't before. That's why, it's really hard to get a job these days. And similarly, we got these things over the horizon like life extension, which I think are going to be a disaster for a whole variety of reasons that, politically we have no way of dealing with. So,
Yeah, and how big a threat is that to liberal democracy in technologically driven income inequality?
Well, it's a big threat. I think Aristotle actually made the observation that democracies work better when there's not a lot of very rich people and a lot of very poor people. And if you don't believe that, just look at Latin America, where there's always been a much greater, gap between rich and poor, and you got this populist, alternation between authoritarian government and populist, anti-elite governments that have characterized that region. And I think, you could see the United States falling into some version of that if this continues. And in fact, one of the strange things, especially since the financial crisis, is why isn't there more populism in the United States, given, these underlying economic that may be a separate question. But yes, it is definitely a threat. And by the way, it's one where the solution is not at all obvious. 50 years ago, you would have had a lot of people on the left that would have said the solution is social democracy, just redistribute all the money from the rich people to the poor people, and and we do that. We do a lot of redistribution, and it's necessary, and so forth. But it does seem to me that the magnitude of the problem has grown, to the point that it's going to be very, very hard, to keep that system going and to maintain the kind of innovation, prosperity that fuels the whole system.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's add a dimension to the inequality problem. Already healthcare, at least in the absence of universal health coverage, is unequally distributed, and we seem to be on the verge of a number of very expensive kind of biomedical or biotechnical interventions in the realm of what is sometimes called transhumanism, where you really start, changing what it means to be a human, and people get augmentations, and they get smarter or they get more athletic. Well, clearly those are going to be expensive at first. It's going to be impractical for them to be covered by universal health coverage. At least it's going to be a real challenge. Now, you wrote a book called Our Post-Human Future, and what I remember from it is that, leave aside this distribution question, you just were kind of grossed out by the whole thing. I mean, you on almost philosophical grounds have grave reservations about getting in the business of this kind of augmentation. So I kind of have two questions. I mean, one is elaborate a little on that, your reservations about the whole business, but there's separately, it seems to me, the problem of a form of inequality that is more grotesque almost than just regular economic inequality.
Well, I think both of those are real issues. I mean, the problem I have with something like genetic engineering is that I just do not believe that we will know what we're doing when we get into this. That we will decide that human beings, have these bad qualities and these good qualities, and we want to get fewer of the bad qualities and more of the good ones, and we simply do not understand in evolutionary terms why they're there. Something like aggression, for example. I would suspect as an evolutionary psychologist, you understand that there's actually good reasons why aggression exists in human beings, and that a lot of things that human societies have done would not be possible without that particular, whatever genes control that particular feature. And if you decide, okay, we're just going to edit them out, the consequences are really going to be hard to predict for what the shape of human societies is going to be like. And so I just think that the enhancement uses of this technology, the therapeutic stuff I think is fine, but the enhancement uses of this gets us into very questionable, moral ground, because we're basically altering, what it means to be a human being, and that is the basis ultimately of our whole sense of rights, and the political system kind of depends. The Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, based on, the equality of their natures. And once you start monkeying with that, a lot of that, I think goes out the window.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, on the issue of aggression, as long as you brought it up, I guess I'd say there are good evolutionary reasons by evolution's lights why there's aggression, which is to say it was good at getting genes into the next generation. That doesn't mean it was ever particularly conducive to social stability necessarily, and of course certain things like rage, as manifest in road rage, become counterproductive in a way that they weren't originally. So I'm not in that sense, for those reasons, opposed to us trying to change ourselves, and we all try to change ourselves even without this technology, of course, along some of these very dimensions. But it does, just to get back to the original problem, doesn't it seem like the nightmare I'm describing is almost impossible to stop? I mean, in other words, originally eugenics 100 years ago was something that could only happen in a centralized way, because it involved, coercively preventing reproduction, basically, and that's something that you can only do if you're a powerful state or something. Now it just seems like it's the opposite. Unless you can find a way to stop affluent parents from doing it, it is going to happen in a decentralized way. It's like a homemade eugenics, And the only way to stop it is with a, you know, from a centralized standpoint, and I'm not sure I imagine the political will being there, or the political logic being there.
No, I think that's wrong. I disagree. I think you can regulate this stuff, and we regulate all sorts of things. I mean, today we regulate biomedicine like crazy. I mean, you do not permit experimentation on human subjects. Every university's got an IRB, you know, that permits certain kinds of experiments and not others. And I mean, I think people misunderstand the way that this kind of regulation works. If your goal, you know, for example, it is legal in this country to try to reproductively clone a human being, I think it should be made illegal. And I think we could pass a ban like this and we could enforce it. Will there be an individual doctor that may try to skirt the law and do an experiment? Yeah, maybe, but you know, it doesn't matter if it's just a matter of, you know, a couple of weird individuals, but overall you could maintain, you know, that kind of ban, I think, you know, pretty easily. There'd be a pretty easy moral consensus, you know, around that. So, yeah, I mean, I just think people somehow have this idea that you cannot stop science regardless of what. We stop science all the time. All of our environmental rules are designed to stop science in a certain sense from doing damage, you know, to our planet. Is it going to be ultimately successful? That's another question, but, you know, is it worth trying? Of course it is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm in favor of trying. Quick question about one of my hobby horses, global governance. I mean, we mentioned Nonzero, and we both face the problem of people saying, you got it wrong, the world is worse than you said. One of my answers is that I said that to make the transition from to a cohesive global society, we needed more in the way of global governance. And you've mentioned rivalry with China, one area which, you know, I think where trouble could conceivably be subdued if there were clearer rules of the road in kind of a respected version of global governance about, you know, boundaries and islands and so on. But in general, do you agree that global governance is something that needs to grow, and has it grown enough, or do you think it doesn't especially?
The answer is yes, it needs to grow, and no, it has not grown enough.
Are there particular examples?
Well, I mean, just name a field where you need it. You know, financial regulation, counterterrorism, you know, dealing with drugs, you know, internationally, you know, global warming. I mean, the list goes on and on. I mean, every single one of those requires, you know, a high degree of international cooperation, coordination, and in every single one of those, the existing institutions are not sufficient. So yes, that's a big problem.
Okay. And speaking of global warming, we haven't brought it up. A lot of people, if you ask them about the future, that would be number one on their list of problems. And I guess one reason I haven't brought it up is because, for that reason, we don't really have to. It's kind of getting discussed, certainly in progressive circles. But I'm just curious how grave you think the threat is, if at all.
I think it's potentially an extremely grave threat, but it's, you know, it's one of the hardest ones to deal with if you just look at it in terms of incentives, because, you know, you're being asked to make sacrifices that are costly in the short run to benefit either future generations that don't vote or people in other countries that don't vote for you. And it's as simple as that. I mean, so no politician has really got a strong incentive to actually, you know, act on it. So it's not surprising that we haven't done very much in this, you know, in this area. Mm-hmm. And this is one where I think it basically is going to be a question of technology, because I don't think that you're going to have the international coordination that's actually going to put real constraints on, you know, fossil fuel use. I think that it's going to have to come through just the development of technological alternatives. It'll get cheap enough that, you know, you can do it without, you know, without the economic pain.
So you have a kind of faith in technology then. And it's partly because just the collective action problem is so,
yeah.
You think whether or not technology will provide the fix, it almost has to, because the collective action problem is so complicated.
I suspect so.
Although if global governance were more fully evolved, it might seem less so. Let me As long as we're on my hobby horses, let's move from global governance to something I like to call moral imagination. It's by which I mean just the ability to put yourself in the shoes of people in very different circumstances from yourself. I don't mean so much kind of emotional empathy, you know, feeling their pain, just the ability to understand what things look like from their point of view. And I think at a couple of levels we haven't shown a tremendous ability to do this. One is, you know, to get back to the terrorism issue, just kind of, you know, being able to say, well, wait, if I were a Muslim, you know, what kind of thing would incline me toward jihadism and so on? I don't think we're especially good at that. But another is in the old-fashioned kind of realpolitik sense of just being able to put yourself in Putin's shoes, say. And I don't think we've done a great job of that. I mean, and I'm wondering, first of all, whether you agree. Well, I remember you had an argument with Bob Kagan saying that the intervention in Kosovo, I think, from Russia's point of view, might give it license to do something in Georgia, which it actually did. Bob did not agree. And this is, well, it's a two-part question. So let me hear do you think we're not nearly as good at this as we could be?
Well, I think you're talking about two different phenomena. One is, you know, do we generate sympathy for people in difficult circumstances?
Yeah, that's not so much what emotional. I'm talking more about
but that's
cognitive
important. I
empathy
mean,
than
it's important in something like the Syrian, you know, migrant crisis. That I actually think that the ability of people to sympathize with people that they would have had zero to do with in a previous age is just incomparably greater. You know, because you can send a television camera into the refugee camp, you know, you can, and it plays out in a lot of different ways. So every time we have one of these shooting incidents, you know, you have a week of coverage of, you know, how did the family react, you know, when their daughter was killed by the, you know, the bullet and so forth. And it generates a huge, you know, emotional response, but it's now doing it across borders. And so I think actually the ability, you know, I mean, I kind of live in a world where half my students actually want to go, you know, to sub-Saharan Africa and work in a poor country in order to, you know, help people that they have no social connection with whatsoever. The only reason they know about it is because of our ability to morally imagine the situation of, you know, somebody in that situation. Now, what you're talking about is something different, which is a more elite phenomenon, which is, do our policymakers have the adequate kind of historical, cultural background to really appreciate what's motivating their rivals in the international stage? And, you know, there I would say, yeah, maybe we've got some problems. I mean, I personally actually think I can put myself in Putin's shoes quite well, and I still don't think he's right, but...
right, he's not right, but even if you don't think that, sometimes if you know what they're thinking, you can avert, like I personally think the Ukraine thing might have been averted if people had understood what all of that represented to him. You know, before all the fighting started, without any of the bad stuff happening. But the second part of the question was going to be, is it my imagination, and you're peculiarly well-suited to answer this, is it my imagination, or are neoconservatives bad at this? I mean, really, and do they almost, not all of them...
I don't think it's neoconservative. I think Americans are just bad at this. I mean, Americans don't learn foreign languages. They tend, you know, compared to people that live in small countries where people don't speak your language and where you have to travel to get jobs and this sort of thing, you know, we're not that cosmopolitan, and we don't see things, you know, we tend not to see things from other people's vantage point, and we've got this, you know, tradition of kind of understanding our own institutions as, you know, in some sense exemplary, and therefore, you know, we don't even, I mean, it's interesting, we've got a project at my center at Stanford on American politics and comparative perspective, but even if you look at academic political scientists in the United States, the ones that study American politics don't study anything other than American politics. You know, they don't study it in the context of, you know, what are the institutions like in Germany or Japan or, you know, other developed democracies. And so in that respect, I think the sort of the provincialism or the self-regarding nature of a lot of our discourse is it's not just neoconservatives. I think it's a lot of people.
Yeah, I agree. It is a lot of people. most annoyingly neoconservatives, but that's
Wow.
so we should probably open up to Q&A. I want to close with one more question, as long as we're on the subject of neoconservatives.
You really got that on the brain, Bob. I mean,
Oh, totally, yeah. I could go on and on. If anyone's curious in the question and answer session and would like a 30-minute sermon on neoconservatives, I'm available. But I'm wondering about your break with the neoconservatives. Is there a particular thing you've really rethought that about your prior beliefs, or did you just slowly come to believe that their agenda was not productive? Did you learn more about them that led you to break from them, or did you revisit beliefs, or what?
No, well, so it was a little bit of both, but I think that, they also moved away from what they believed. So the first generation of neoconservatives around Irving Kristol and Daniel Bell and, the founders of the Public Interest magazine were all focused on domestic politics, but about the unanticipated consequences of overly ambitious social engineering. And they, worried about, welfare dependency and crime and a lot of other issues, which I thought was actually quite sensible. And I think that the next generation of neoconservatives, meaning people like Bob Kagan and, Bill Kristol and so forth, just threw all that out the window, that they developed this idea that American power could reshape the politics of this culturally, historically, geographically extremely distant and unfamiliar part of the world called the Middle East, and stuff that they would never dare to do in American politics, they're perfectly willing to do in the Middle East. I just thought this was, this was kind of nuts. But, a lot of it also, I guess, just has to do with my own connection with the developing world and just understanding how difficult it is for outsiders to understand what's going on and to really shape events and so forth. And so it was a kind of hubris, to believe that you could, be the master of that situation.
Okay. So now let's go to questions and answers. I want to say that in one of the blurbs about this, there was an allusion to talking about the question of whether history might, in some sense, be a manifestation of a larger purpose unfolding or something. I didn't actually get to that. I'm happy to talk about it if somebody's, I have my own ideas about that if somebody's interested, so feel free to bring it up. I think the short answer from you is you do not have a teleological view of history, which is interesting in itself because often directional views have been teleological, or they've imputed a purpose to history. Is that, do I have you right there?
I would say that I am agnostic on that question. Tocqueville actually, when he taught in the preface to his book Democracy in America, noted the spread of equality over the previous 800 years, and he said it's providential, meaning that it's basically God that is driving this process, and I'm open to the possibility that God is driving it. I mean, I have no proof that he's not driving it.
Well, I think it's also, as long as we brought it up, it's also possible that, and maybe this is what you're saying, my own view of history, the one I traced in Nonzero, was totally mechanistic. I didn't see any spooky forces intervening and driving it, but it still seemed to me that the direction, the unfolding of the kind of algorithm of physical causation or whatever was suggestive that maybe the whole system had a purpose. So this would, as long as we're here at a theological seminary, this would be more consistent with a kind of a deistic scenario than a theistic scenario. But I do think you can, especially if you step back and look at the very beginning of life and trace the whole thing and see how organization has gone to higher and higher levels, cell, multicellular life, societies. You get information processing systems moving to new discrete levels, genome, and then brain, and now we're building like a global brain, and this is the culmination of human society having passed through all these higher and higher levels of organization. And in my own view, whether we close the deal in terms of establishing a cohesive global society, that actually, depending on further moral progress, including moral imagination, various other things, I think you could you could make the case without suggesting that there's, again, some kind of spooky forces. You could view it as in materialist terms, but I guess Marx had a materialist yet teleological view, so
Right.
it's been done before. So now you don't have to ask about it. Why don't we start with you in the red scarf? And do we have? I think we have microphones.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad that that last question came up because I was hoping we talk more about it. And also what your view is of the role of stark religious differences is in your whole discussion of where history is headed.
Well, on the question of so in my view, religion actually is an integrative, has historically been an integrative force. It's a way of getting people to cooperate way beyond the family and lineages and, the sorts of things that brought people together at earlier stages in history. But then, we now have this problem that you've got multiple religions coexisting and, highly pluralistic societies where people don't agree on religious first principles. And the question is, how do you mitigate, those kinds of conflicts? I would say that what happened in the West was you went after the Reformation, after the Protestant Reformation, you had about 150 years of pretty unremitting warfare in Europe over sectarian kinds of issues. And the reason that modern liberalism evolved in Europe was not that it was somehow natural, it didn't come out of Christian doctrine or out of deep, cultural traditions in Europe. It came out of the fact that people were sick of fighting and killing each other over final ends. And so what liberalism does is basically say, okay, politically we're not going to discuss final ends. You can think about that in the privacy of your own homes. Politically, we are going to be neutral with regard to religion and, and so forth. And so I think right now what's going on in the Middle East is you're having a Muslim version of that. You're having really for the first time since the 7th century a real civil war, going on between different sects of Muslims. And they're killing each other. And, in my view, the question then is, will there come a point, hopefully not taking 150 years as it did in Europe, but a shorter period of time in which people will say, hey, I've got this brilliant idea. What about religious tolerance, as an alternative to, this kind of strict application of Sharia law and killing of unbelievers and so forth. Unfortunately, that means that region is just going to have to go through a fair amount of violence before you get to that point. I certainly don't think that outsiders can provide a kind of model, and in fact the West has been holding up this ideal of liberal tolerance, and it's been rejected, in the short run by a lot of the players in that, in that region. So I just think that this is a process that's got to work itself out, in that part of the world.
Well, I guess the only thing I'd add is that I think it's interesting that, the wars of religion in Europe followed the introduction of a disruptive information technology, the printing press, which had the effect of decentralizing in some ways power. It undermined the power of, for example, the Catholic Church, and just began a kind of a redistribution of power that's in many ways analogous, I think, to what the internet has done. And I just think when technologies do that, it gets back to what I was saying about it taking a while for society to catch up with technological disruption. And I think there's various things going on as a result of the internet, not all of which are good. I guess that's all I'd add. Maybe over here?
So you spoke about, in the beginning, China being perhaps our greatest adversary in the future. And I'm just wondering, is it inconceivable to think that with all of the existing technologies for spreading ideas that they wouldn't demand representative government? And if not, is that something in their cultural DNA?
I'm sorry, they wouldn't
demand representative government.
Why wouldn't they,
Oh, yeah.
you know, at some point in the future, demand representative government? If not, is it something in their cultural DNA, or you know, what else do you attribute it to?
Well, I don't think there is such a thing as cultural DNA. I mean, there's culture, but it's not fixed, you know, genetically or like DNA, because cultures evolve. And so, well, so I think what's happening, what will play out in China is as it gets richer, you'll have a larger middle class. Currently, there's 400 or 500 million people in China that are really, you know, middle class right now. And in other parts of the world, when you've got a middle class society, people have tended to demand political participation. And that's the standard, you know, kind of modernization model that a lot of social theorists have pointed to. And the question, you know, for China is, will that play out in China as well? I've had arguments with Chinese, you know, advocates of the China model on precisely this question. They say, oh no, China's completely different. We're culturally, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're middle class or not. We, you know, we prefer hierarchy, authoritarian government, and so forth. And I'm, you know, I sort of think that it is true that in the short run, the middle class in China right now are not big supporters of democracy. I think for pretty good historical reasons, that they just don't want the, you know, they're doing pretty well right now, and they don't want to take any risks with that. But they certainly want more liberty. I mean, they want more individual freedom. They don't want the government, you know, censoring the internet and doing all the things that they're doing. So I do think that there's really a kind of social basis as they get richer, better educated, better connected, for something that will look like the evolution that took place in Europe and, you know, other Western countries down the road.
Yeah, and I think the Chinese government clearly is worried about the implications of the new information technology, which is why they're trying so hard to control it. And in fact, there is a certain amount of, at kind of the grassroots level, using things like cell phones to organize protests, you know, about corruption and environmental depredations. There's been a kind of, not democracy, but a kind of pluralism in China, because the government does tend to respond to demonstrations, try to head them off, try to suppress them if possible, but also sometimes respond to the grievances. So, I mean, I think the story's not over there yet. Maybe one...
This person in the front has had his hand up from the beginning.
Right here?
Yeah, no, yeah.
In the second row, or?
Thank you. I wanted to bring you all in the direction more of the potential apocalyptic scenarios. So as I was listening to the talk unfold, which was great, by the way, I was thinking of a number of things. One is kind of perennial human concerns, particularly empires toppling empires, which has been happening since antiquity. My concern is that America certainly is, to an extent, kind of an imperial kind of entity, economically, culturally, to some extent even militarily. And although it seems kind of impossible for it to topple, we kind of learn from history that that's never quite the case. And with the potential for nuclear warfare, that kind of seems a relatively fair chance that might be an apocalypse scenario. Another thing was this relationship between China and the United States, which seems stable for now for economic reasons. But as we both continue to develop, it seems that Deng Xiaoping's reforms seem to eventually open China up to this kind of idea of democracy of the marketplace, which I think can kind of flourish in China, is continuing to, which I think kind of developed in the United States during the Clinton-Greenspan era, where people kind of demand less from their political systems, more from the economy, the ability to choose through consumption. And my concern there is kind of a Marxist concern, is that essentially the accumulation of capital seems to be being directed more in the hands of the most wealthy people in society. To what extent could that potentially cause a financial scenario where globally we're all kind of financially in trouble and there's kind of a sinkhole that's entire, and then of course climate change, which is already addressed, but those two potential apocalyptic scenarios.
So, I mean, I do think that there is a problem in the global economy right now, that there's too much capital relative to demand. I think that most of the crises that have happened over the last decade have been related to that. You know, too much capital chasing too little demand. that was ultimately the cause of our financial crisis, the one in Europe and so forth, which in turn is partly a byproduct of the inequality, that the capitalists tended to end up in the hands of, smaller, kind of elite. And you would think that at a certain point that's going to be politically, it's already been financially destabilizing, and presumably it's going to be politically destabilizing, although I am kind of struck, given this reality, that there is such a weak left everywhere, both in the United States and in Europe and, Asia. And why that's the case, is maybe a topic for another one of your sessions. But I think in terms of dystopias, there's a completely different one from this empire of capital and power, which is the universalization of Somalia scenario, which is really where the Middle East, the Arab Middle East, seems to be going right now, where the problem is really not that there's rich, powerful people that are, lording it over everybody else, but that no one can establish any kind of legitimate authority anywhere. And that you have this kind of leaching out of power. Moises Naim wrote this book a couple of years ago called The End of Power, in which he noted that hierarchical institutions, Catholic Church, labor unions, political parties, governments, all of them have seen this, this problem with authority, that none of them can exert authority in the way that they need to. Now, from one perspective, you say that's great because they're all tyrannical to begin with, but truth of the matter is that societies need to make decisions, they need to engage in collective action for a lot of different purposes, and if nobody can agree on doing anything, then, eventually you have this very chaotic situation where everybody can stop things, but nobody can actually, decide to do anything. And that, I think, is also a dystopia, which is the opposite one from the centralized tyranny empire dystopia that I think is, these days, I would say in a significant part of the world, that's the one that I worry about much more. Like the Middle East today, I don't see any way that this Humpty Dumpty is going to be put back together in the next few years.
In the baseball cap, is that a Village Voice baseball cap or just a Voice baseball cap? In that case, proceed, yes.
Yeah. There's a person at the University of Pennsylvania named Philip Tetlock. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He runs forecasting tournaments, and he's identified people who he calls super forecasters. And unlike yourself, they tend to be people like computer nerds, not people, they're very analytical and don't have a religious or political bias, and that's why they're able to do so well. And he's claimed that he's invited people like yourself or Thomas Friedman, he mentions, and everyone refuses to enter his tournaments because they'd be on record on how good they are. Have either of you been invited, or would you enter such a tournament?
I'm available. I have not been invited.
No, right. Bruce Bueno de Mesquita also uses game theory to kind of make these. Yeah, but I don't regard myself as a futurist. If Bob asks me what I think is going to happen in the Middle East, I'll give you my opinion. But I don't. That's not what I do. I look at the past because it's very hard to generate, empirical views on what's going to happen in the future. Well, yeah, okay, but that's different, predicting.
What is your prediction about Donald Trump?
Well, okay, let me back up a little. So, I really do not think that, I remember being asked in the early 1990s what would happen to North Korea, and I very confidently said, oh, they're going to be gone in a few years. There's no way this regime is going to, and here we are in 2015, they're still there. So I really do not, think my forte is, making predictions. Now, you can, any kind of intelligent observer of politics will note certain trends and certain regularities, and then you apply them, and, if the prediction is what's going to happen in an election that's going to happen in less than a year, then, you can bound the problem, and you're not going to be able to make a prediction, but you can sort of intelligently speculate about things. So I think that sort of thing is possible. But I don't regard that as my core business, so that's why have no interest in entering, into any, especially competing against a computer. I don't want to do that.
Okay, so I'm afraid we're running out of time. What I'd like to do is take 3 questions in succession and then give Frank the opportunity to give whatever response he thinks in light of these, he wants to give in light of these 3 questions. I would ask that they be brief and have question marks and stuff. So we'll take one from each group. In the kind of orangish, okay, and then in the New York, I thought that was a Mets cap. I'm reconsidering, but it's a Yankees cap. But we'll go with you anyway. And then in the 3rd row, you, yes. So if we'll just ask quick questions in that order, and then give Frank a chance to respond.
Yeah, my question is relative to kind of how you see the arc or the trajectory of race relations, particularly in America, with the controversy that's been ensuing over the last year or so.
Okay. So race, and then
my question is about sort of relevant to the venue that we're at. What do you see as the role of social, political, public role of faith in future trajectories? And the reason I'm asking this question is because I think, or I detect some common ground between your view of history and sort of meta-narratives of secularization, sort of Norris and Engelhardt I have in mind. I wonder if you share their view about, the role of faith, that it's on its way out in modern post-industrial societies.
Okay.
So you've talked and written a little bit about elite capture of institutions as a phase of social decline. And in the United States, to an extent, we have seen that with interest groups and so forth. How do you see, are those institutions salvageable, or does it necessitate the creation of new institutions? Or if they are salvageable, how can that be accomplished?
Okay. Okay, so on the question of race, so I just told you that I'm out of the business of making predictions. I would make the following observation. There have been 2 fascinating books written in the last 3 years. One by the very conservative Charles Murray called Coming Apart, the Fate of White America. And the second one just published this past year by Bob Putnam at Harvard called Our Kids. And they present really stunning data which shows that the biggest divide in the United States today is a class divide. It is not a racial or an ethnic or a gender divide. That the trajectories of people with a college education or better have gone like this since the 1980s, and high school or less have just gone like this. And that this is true for white people, for black people, for Hispanics, for women, and the basic argument is that actually class has displaced, these other identities as, the most important divide, but it is one that's not recognized in our politics. And in fact, the politics, especially in the Democratic Party, remains, completely focused on, identity politics, and the class issue is not, taken up by anybody really, except maybe a little bit by Bernie Sanders, but even then, he's kind of had to. So this is a way of avoiding answering your question. I actually think that, I don't know, I can see that as an identity politics issue, given that we have much more information, for example, on police behavior, I don't think the police are behaving any worse today than they ever were. It's just that people are much more aware of it, and they're going to be more aware of it with better, surveillance and cameras and, this sort of thing. And so it's going to be something that we'll have to work through. But I do think that it's very interesting that, all of these different groups around which we organize our lives actually don't correspond to what's the biggest gap in our actual social reality. Question about Engelhardt and values and religion. So in general, the old view of modernization theory that modernization would bring about secularization and decline of religion is it's just wrong. I mean, the only part of the world where that's true is Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, in Latin America, in India, in the United States, there has been really no decline overall in religious belief or, organized religion as people have gotten richer. There are shifts in values, which Engelhardt talks about, so people have become more liberal in many respects, but the actual degree of religious belief has really not changed. And then on the question of what to do about elite capture in the United States, I don't know. I wish I had an answer to that, because normally, see, the thing about elite capture is that because elites are capturing the system, it's very hard to displace them. And they will not voluntarily, cede ground. And so efforts at campaign finance reform and all that stuff gets nowhere. And so generally speaking, what you have to have is an external shock. You have to have a financial crisis, a war, some really big event that knocks people off of their comfortable equilibrium. And you would have thought the last financial crisis would have done that. But it wasn't big enough, We only had 10, 12% unemployment, not the 25% in the Great Depression. And so I'm not quite sure, so I do think that you're going to need some kind of a real triggering event that will actually get people serious about, getting at some of the core structural issues that are causing or to reverse the elite capture. But unfortunately, that may be a pretty, horrendous thing for people to live through in the short run.
Okay, well, thank you. I said at the beginning that Frank has grappled with a lot of big ideas, and I think that claim has been borne out. And he deserves special thanks for taking a red eye out here. He had to work yesterday in California, so he took a red eye out last night and seems none the worse for it. And by the way, if you're interested in the latest in sleep-inducing technology, I asked him what he uses to sleep on an airplane, and he said a martini. So there's a tip for you travelers. So we thank you for that little bit of information and all of the other insights, Frank. Thank you.